Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, our mission is, well, it's pretty critical. We're diving into a specialized text on high-risk pregnancy. We want to pull out the absolute core knowledge about how nutrition really shapes the beginning, the management, and ultimately the outcome of these serious conditions.
Exactly. We're aiming to cut through some of the complex medical stuff to get to the why. Why are certain women at higher risk, and how can specific nutritional approaches, or sometimes the lack of them, actually change the path for conditions like preeclampsia, gestational diabetes, and the challenges that come with carrying twins or more.
Yeah, this is all about getting actionable, evidence-based insight fast. We're
hmm
tackling quite a bit today. We'll start with pre-pregnancy health, specifically obesity, then move into hypertensive disorders, diabetes, the big nutritional needs for multifetal pregnancies. And then we'll finish up with some important nuance challenges like eating disorders and even teen pregnancy. We're looking for the thread that connects these, right?
And a thread, really, it starts with metabolic health, its foundation.
Okay, let's unpack this. A good place to start is where many high-risk pregnancies begin, with overweight or obesity before conception. Our sources really stress how important it is to approach this with non-judgmental, factual care, because the increase in risk is, well, it's quite steep. We know things like gestational diabetes and preeclampsia risks go up, but what's actually happening physiologically? What's driving that risk?
Well, what's really interesting here, the source points out a key difference between types of fat. It's not just about how much fat tissue someone has, it's about where it is. The real danger seems to come from the highly active visceral fat. That's the fat stored deep inside the abdomen, around the organs. It's much more metabolically disruptive than the subcutaneous fat just under the skin.
So this visceral fat isn't just sitting there, it's like an active chemical factory.
Precisely. It kicks off this kind of sustained, low-level chronic inflammation. And oxidative stress, too, generating free radicals all through the body. This whole disruption, it really messes with your entire system. It leads pretty directly to insulin resistance. And you see higher blood glucose, higher triglycerides.
And when you look at the actual outcome data, the numbers are pretty sobering, aren't they? The source mentions that for women classified as extremely obese, rates of gestational diabetes can shoot up to nearly 21%, and preeclampsia up to over 16%. Okay, so given those risks, if a woman is already pregnant, what's the nutritional game plan? Do we actually recommend weight loss then?
Oh, absolutely not. No. Weight loss during pregnancy is strongly discouraged. It could potentially harm fetal growth and development. The focus shifts entirely. It becomes about preventing excessive weight gain. And that usually means a pretty significant lifestyle shift. We're talking dietary patterns low in simple sugars, refined carbs, red and processed meats, and really maximizing vegetables, fruits, whole grains, lean proteins. Plus, that has to go hand in hand with regular, moderate physical activity, aiming for at least 30 minutes most days.
Right, that makes sense for general advice. But what about the specific situation where a woman has had bariatric surgery, like, say, a Roux-en gastric bypass? That seems like a whole different ballgame, nutritionally speaking.
Oh, it absolutely is. It introduces risks tied to both that rapid weight loss post-surgery and, crucially, nutrient malabsorption. It's really critical to postpone pregnancy until weight is stable, and that can sometimes take several years. You see, the surgical changes, especially how they rearrange the gut, often lead to chronic shortages of key micronutrients. So they often need higher dose supplements. Vitamins D, B12, folate, zinc, and especially iron. These are major, major concerns.
And I see the source points out a really practical problem here. Even the standard screening for gestational diabetes can become risky for these women.
Yes, that's a key point. For most pregnancies, the standard is that 75-gram oral glucose tolerance test. But for someone who's had bariatric surgery, that huge, fast sugar load can trigger something called dumping syndrome. It causes severe nausea, dizziness, diarrhea. Basically, the sugar rushes way too quickly into the small intestine. So clinicians absolutely have to use alternatives. Things like regular home blood glucose monitoring, or just checking fasting glucose levels to avoid that nasty side effect.
Okay, we talked about how that metabolic disruption, often fueled by inflammation from visceral fat, can start early. That idea of chronic inflammation is actually a perfect bridge to talking about hypertensive disorders of pregnancy. These affect what? Up to 10% of pregnancies worldwide, and they're still a major cause of maternal mortality.
That underlying metabolic issue is the connection. You see, all forms of high blood pressure in pregnancy are fundamentally linked back to chronic inflammation and the oxidative stress that comes with it. And this stress, it damages the endothelium. That's the really important lining inside the blood vessels. When that's damaged, we call it endothelial dysfunction.
So if the inside lining of the blood vessels isn't working properly, what does that mean for the pregnancy itself?
Well, the main consequence is poor placental function. The blood flow to the placenta gets restricted. The blood also becomes more likely to clot, and you can even get plaque forming inside those vital vessels. This is really the root cause of conditions like preeclampsia. Our sources break down hypertension in pregnancy into four main types. There's chronic hypertension, which was there before pregnancy or shows up before 20 weeks. Then gestational hypertension, which pops up after 20 weeks, but without signs of organ damage like protein in the urine. Then preeclampsia, that's the high blood pressure after 20 weeks, plus evidence of proteinuria or other signs of end organ issues, think severe headaches, maybe low platelet counts. And finally, the most severe form, eclampsia, which is preeclampsia complicated by seizures.
Now, the nutritional advice for preeclampsia, it seems like there's a lot of myth busting involved here. People often think certain supplements must help prevent it, but the evidence seems to say otherwise.
That's a really crucial takeaway, yes. Despite what you might hear or what seems logical, large clinical trials have pretty clearly shown that high-dose supplements, things like vitamin C and E, fish oils, extra folic acid, magnesium, even garlic, they are ineffective for preventing preeclampsia. Often, the thinking is that by the time these supplements are started, the underlying damage to the placenta and blood vessels is already too far along for them to really stop the disease process.
So the focus has to stay on the whole diet then, aiming for one that actively reduces inflammation and oxidative stress, like lots of colorful fruits and veggies, fiber, low-fat dairy, lean proteins, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. And there's a specific warning note about iron, too. While iron supplements are essential if someone has anemia, high doses can actually worsen inflammation because they can increase the body's free radical load. So they should generally be avoided in women who already have preeclampsia, unless there's a confirmed deficiency that absolutely needs treating. It's just a stark reminder, really, that the only definitive cure for severe preeclampsia or eclampsia is delivering the placenta.
Okay, let's shift gears now to diabetes in pregnancy. The source mentioned something called the diabetogenic effect of pregnancy. Basically, every pregnancy pushes the body in that direction as it goes on. Why does that happen?
It's down to placental hormones. They naturally increase insulin resistance. It's sort of the body's way of making sure the fetus gets a steady supply of glucose. But in some women, their pancreas just can't produce enough extra insulin to overcome that resistance. That leads to high blood sugar, and that's gestational diabetes mellitus, or GDM. It affects roughly 6 to 9% of pregnancies, maybe even more now.
And what's the risk mechanism there? How does the mother's high blood sugar affect the baby?
It's quite direct, actually.
Yeah.
High maternal blood glucose crosses the placenta very easily. The fetus senses this sugar overload and responds by making more of its own insulin. Now, that excess fetal insulin acts almost like a growth hormone. It drives the synthesis of fat and muscle, and that can lead to macrosomia, which is when newborns are significantly larger than average, defined typically as over 4,500 grams, or about 9 pounds, 15 ounces.
Wow. And the risk isn't just about being a big baby at birth, is it? This early metabolic stress can have effects much later in life too, right?
It certainly can. This exposure seems to sort of program the offspring. It increases their risk down the line for developing insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, and obesity themselves. We see this effect quite tragically played out in certain populations, like the Pima Indians. Their very high rates of type 2 diabetes have been linked to both genetic factors and, significantly, major shifts in diet and activity levels. They've become a key group for studying these intergenerational effects of GDM.
So for managing GDM, diet and exercise are the first line of attack. The goal is tight control keeping fasting glucose, ideally between 70 and 95 milli-GDL. What does the diet structure look like?
The absolute key is distribution. Yes, carbohydrate intake is usually around 45% of total calories, but it must be spread out across regular meals and snacks. This helps keep blood sugar stable. We focus on swapping out high sugar, refined carbs for more nutrient-dense options. Think whole grains, vegetables, nuts, plenty of fiber. The target for fiber is an adequate intake of about 28 grams per day. Fiber is great because it slows down how quickly glucose gets absorbed.
And we can't forget the risk after pregnancy either. About half of women who have GDM will get it again in a future pregnancy. And maybe even more concerning, they have a 7 times higher risk of developing type 2 diabetes themselves later on.
That's right. The long-term implications are significant. And just briefly on diabetes that existed before pregnancy, women with type 2 need to switch from their oral medications to insulin, ideally before they even conceive. For women with type 1 diabetes, those pregnancies are automatically high risk. They face higher chances of things like preeclampsia and kidney problems. For them, aiming for even higher fiber intake, maybe 28 to 35 grams a day, can actually help reduce how much insulin they need. But the most critical thing for anyone with pre-existing diabetes is getting excellent blood glucose control before conception. That's crucial to lower the risk of serious congenital malformations, especially those affecting the baby's pelvis, central nervous system, and heart.
Okay, let's turn our attention now to multifetal pregnancies, twins, triplets, and so on. Twin rates have gone up, but thankfully, due to better practices in assisted reproductive technologies or RT, triplets and higher order multiples are becoming less common.
hmm But these pregnancies are inherently high risk. They come with much higher rates of complications, preeclampsia again, anemia, and especially preterm delivery. The scale of the challenge is just huge. The source notes that for triplets, there's a staggering 95% rate of low birth weight. Just immense.
I found the data on fetal growth really striking. The source describes a figure 5.5, showing that for multiples, fetal weight gain kind of keeps pace with singletons up until about 28 weeks. But then the rate drops off quite sharply. Why is that 28-week point so significant?
It seems to mark the point where the placenta or placentas and the mother's ability to supply nutrients just can't quite keep up with the combined enormous growth demands of two or more fetuses. The nutritional requirements become immense. There were provisional recommendations from the Institute of Medicine suggesting a woman of normal weight expecting twins needs around 450 extra calories per day compared to her pre-pregnancy needs. And that's just to aim for the recommended total weight gain, which is somewhere in the range of 37 to 54 pounds.
Wow, that's a huge amount of weight gain and a big caloric increase. And the timing of when that gain happens is critical too, isn't it?
It really is. The rate of gain needs to be positive and pretty aggressive right from the start, like aiming for maybe 5 to 7 pounds in the first trimester alone. Then about 1 to 2 pounds per week through the second and third trimesters. The urgency comes from the risk. The text states that weight loss after 28 weeks actually triples the risk of preterm delivery. And beyond just calories, the needs for essential fatty acids, iron, and calcium are also thought to be substantially higher.
Okay, we've got three more key conditions to quickly touch on. Let's start with eating disorders. The text mentions bulimia nervosa is the one most commonly seen during pregnancy.
Right. Women who have or have had eating disorders face higher risks during pregnancy, things like spontaneous abortion, hypertension, preterm labor, anemia. The care for these women has to be incredibly individualized. It really needs to focus on behavioral change strategies and very open communication about body image, weight gain goals.
Yep.
It's complex. The source even mentions an unofficial term, pregorexia, used to describe women who severely restrict their eating during pregnancy, specifically to avoid weight gain. This can lead to serious intrauterine growth problems for the baby. It's a profound challenge, both psychologically and nutritionally.
Yeah, that really highlights the need for a team approach, doesn't it? Involving mental health experts right alongside nutritionists. Okay, next, fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, FASD, still the leading preventable cause of birth defects.
And the mechanism is straightforward but devastating. Alcohol crosses the placenta completely freely, but critically, it hangs around in the fetus's system for much longer than in the mother's. That's because the fetal liver hasn't developed the enzymes needed to break down alcohol efficiently. The outcomes vary on a spectrum, but the most recognized form, fetal alcohol syndrome, or FAS, has specific facial characteristics. That smooth ridge between the nose and upper lip, narrow eye openings, and a thin border on the upper lip. The recommendation is and remains absolute. Women should not drink any alcohol-containing beverages at any point during pregnancy. Zero tolerance.
And finally, adolescent pregnancy. Rates have been declining, which is good news, but the risks are still elevated, especially for teens who get pregnant very soon after they start menstruating, when they're still growing significantly themselves.
Yes, and the key nutritional difference highlighted here is calcium. A pregnant teenager needs significantly more calcium than a pregnant adult. The RDA is 1,300 milligrams per day. That's a full 300 milligrams higher. It's absolutely essential to support her own ongoing bone development while also meeting the massive demand for calcium to build the fetus's skeleton. And ensuring she gets enough vitamin D to help absorb that calcium is equally crucial.
So if we try to tie all these different threads together now, what's the big overarching lesson for practitioners or really anyone trying to understand the nutritional side of high-risk pregnancy?
I think the material really drives home that so much of high-risk pregnancy, whether it's obesity-linked hypertension, GDM, even some aspects of preterm birth, is rooted in that common pathway, metabolic problems driven by chronic inflammation and oxidative stress. Understanding that connection allows for more targeted nutritional management,
focusing on whole diet and lifestyle, not just, say, single supplements. And second, the sheer scale of the demands in multifetal pregnancies is just undeniable. It requires really vigilant monitoring of calories, weight gain, and key micronutrients to try and head off those devastating outcomes, like very preterm delivery.
Yeah, and this knowledge feels so vital because, as you mentioned, the text keeps emphasizing the need for evidence-based practice. It pushes us to constantly question whether what we're doing represents the best practice based on current science, rather than just relying on, this is how we've always done it, assumptions. Assumptions that might actually be ineffective or maybe even harmful, like we saw with some of those supplements tried for preeclampsia. It really makes you think, doesn't it? What widely accepted practice, maybe in your own field or area, might need a closer look to make sure it's truly backed by the latest evidence.
That's a great provocative thought to end on. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this deep dive into the nutritional challenges during pregnancy.